the stage lights dimmed. A sudden, expectant hush swept across the tuxedo-clad crowd. Then, that bass line dropped. A pulse, a groove, a rhythmic heartbeat that defined the early 70s. And then, those voices hit the air. They smile in your face. All the time they want to take your place. The Backstabbers. It was the peak of the Philadelphia sound. On that stage stood three men in tailored silk suits, their movements as synchronized as a Swiss watch. There was Eddie Levert. There was Walter Williams. And standing between them, the man with the angel's range and the sinner's soul, was William Powell. To the thousands in the seats, it was a display of pure, flawless soul. But the reality behind the curtain was a different kind of music. The Philadelphia International Machine sold unity, polish, and brotherhood. But insiders from that era describe a different reality, an assembly line that demanded absolute perfection and offered zero room for human vulnerability. It was a system built on 200-day-a-year tour schedules, relentless recording sessions, and contracts that prioritized the brand over the body. It was a machine that required its stars to be immortal. Even when they were breaking, William Powell was the heart of that machine. And according to those who traveled on those buses, he was the first to start disappearing. While the world was dancing to Love Train, William was carrying secrets that would have broken a lesser man. Later interviews and band accounts reveal a terrifying subtext to his performance. Behind the expensive silk, he was already fighting a quiet internal war. There were whispers of self-medication, substances used to bridge the gap between his grueling schedule and a body that was beginning to fail. There was the constant, gnawing pressure to maintain the image. The fans saw the sweat on his brow. They took it for passion. It was actually the cold sweat of a man in physical agony. They saw the flash of his brilliant smile. They didn't see him clutching his stomach in the wings, gasping for air before the next cue. They heard the high tenor notes. They didn't hear the silence of the doctor's offices. By the time the diagnosis was official, the machine was already looking for a replacement. In the world of high-stakes R&B, the show didn't just go on, it replaced you. William Powell gave his life to the harmony, but the industry he built viewed him as a replaceable cog in a multi-million-dollar engine. No one saw the end coming. No one heard the warning signs. And in the end, no one could save him. This isn't a story about a gold record. It is a post-mortem on a miracle that was used up until the gears ground to a halt. Tonight, we peel back the silk. We look past the choreography. We find the man who died trying to keep the harmony perfect. Before we celebrate the hits, we need to understand the cost. Because the truth is cold. Not everyone survived the love train. Grab your breath. We're going back to Canton, Ohio. To the church, the street corners, and the moment the dream first began to turn into a debt that could never be repaid. Before the silk suits and the private jets, there was Canton, Ohio. In the late 1952, Canton was a town built on steel and sweat, a place where the winters were long and the opportunities for a young black man were short. To understand William Powell, you have to understand the soil he grew up in. It was a landscape of industrial smoke and segregated hope. If you wanted a life that didn't involve a lunch pail and a factory punch card, you had only two real paths, the pulpit or the stage. William Powell chose both. At the tiny church on the corner of 10th Street, William's voice was the primary attraction. It was a high, pure tenor, crystal voice, as some elders called it, that seemed to defy the heavy, soot-stained air of the city. But while the church gave him his technique, the street corners gave him his survival instincts. This is where the records of his life begin to show the first signs of a relentless, almost desperate drive. William wasn't a solo star. He was a piece of a delicate puzzle. Along with his high school classmates, Eddie Levert and Walter Williams, he spent his nights under the dim glow of streetlights, practicing the complex, razor-sharp harmonies of doo-wop. They called themselves the Triumphs. It's a name that feels tragic in hindsight, but at the time, it represented their only exit strategy. The investigative reality of their early years is one of grinding, systematic struggle According to later memoirs from the group and interviews with those who saw them rise, they weren't just singing for fun, they were singing to escape a fate of poverty. Their first real encounter with the industry machine came from Sid Nathan at King Records. Nathan was a man legendary for his brutal business tactics and ironclad contracts. He signed them, but he immediately stripped them of their identity. He forced them to change their name to the Mascots. This was the first lesson William Powell learned about the business of soul. The talent belongs to the artist, but the identity belongs to the man with the checkbook. The Mascots failed to ignite the charts, but the pressure was only beginning to mount. A local DJ named Eddie OJ took them under his wing, giving them his own name, the OJs, and a one-way ticket to Los Angeles. But L2A wasn't a playground. It was a testing ground that pushed them to the brink of collapse. Historical accounts from this period describe a group living on the jagged edge of starvation. There are documented stories of them walking miles to television tapings just for a hot meal in the green room, sleeping in shifts in cramped, bug-infested motels, and recording anonymous backup vocals for pennies. In these early, grueling sessions, William's role became crystallized. He was the stabilizer. While Eddie Levert brought the raw, guttural fire, William was the architect of the precision. He was the one who ensured every high-tenor harmony was mathematically perfect, every note tucked exactly where it needed to be. But in a group dynamic, being the stabilizer comes with a hidden, heavy cost. While the others could let loose or show emotion, William had to be the anchor. He carried the burden of the group's professional polish on his shoulders. By the time they reached Philadelphia in the early 1970 seconds, William Powell had already spent over a decade in the hunger phase. He was a veteran of the road, an expert at hiding exhaustion behind a well-pressed suit. He had learned the industry's most dangerous rule: you never show weakness. You don't complain about the hunger, the cold, or the fatigue. You just hit the note. Kenny Gamble and Leon Huff saw the potential in these hardened men, but they also saw the wear and tear. They gave them Backstabbers, a song about betrayal and paranoia that resonated deeply with men who had already been burned by the business multiple times. When the song hit Hashone, the financial debt of their past was finally cleared. But as the money started to flow, a new and far more lethal debt was being created. It was the debt of fame, and the interest rate was about to be paid in blood. The machine was finally moving at full speed. And William Powell, the quiet stabilizer from Canton, was about to find out exactly what the Philadelphia sound would demand in return for its riches. By 1972, Philadelphia was no longer just a city. It was the capital of a musical empire. Inside the offices of Philadelphia International Records, Kenny Gamble and Leon Huff had perfected a system that would come to be known as the assembly line of soul. It was polished. It was sophisticated. And it was relentless. For the OJs, stepping into this machine was like moving from a bicycle to a jet engine. But as the investigative records of the label's history show, the jet engine required constant fuel. The Philly sound was built on a foundation of massive, lush arrangements, dozens of string players, horn sections, and the tightest rhythm sections in the world. To pay for that luxury, the artists had to produce, and produce fast. The documents of the era reveal a grueling cycle: record in the morning, rehearse in the afternoon, fly to a gig in the evening, and repeat. For William Powell, the stabilizer of the group, this meant there was no longer any time to manage the growing fatigue he had brought from Canton. In a system this expensive, any delay was a loss. Any crack in the harmony was a liability. When Backstabbers exploded onto the global charts, the demand for the OJs tripled overnight. This is where the physical toll began to leave a paper trail. Tour logs from the mid-70 seconds show a schedule that would have broken an athlete, 200 to 250 dates a year. One night in London, the next in Tokyo, the next in Harlem. The human body is not designed for that level of sustained adrenaline, especially when fueled by the high-sodium diet of the road and the lack of consistent sleep. Eddie Levert and Walter Williams were the powerhouses, but insiders noted that William began to change. He was losing weight. His famous glow was becoming a pale, waxen mask. This is the moment where the investigative lens finds the first mentions of chemical support. In the early 70 seconds R&B scene, heroin wasn't just a party drug, it was a professional tool. It was used to numb the bone-deep exhaustion of the road. It was used to quiet the anxiety of performing for thousands while your body was screaming for rest. For William, who carried the responsibility of the group's intricate harmonies, the pressure to be perfect every single night was a weight that required a heavy counterbalance. But there was something else, something the drugs couldn't hide. While the world was celebrating Love Train as an anthem of global unity, William Powell was beginning to experience sharp, localized pain that no amount of substance could mask. In the assembly line of the music business, there is a term called "the show must go on." It is a noble sentiment, but it is also a corporate mandate. If a star goes down, the tour cancels. If the tour cancels, the label loses millions. William understood the math. He saw himself as a guardian of his brother's success. If he stopped, Eddie and Walter stopped. So, he kept his mouth shut. He tucked his pain under his tailored vest, hit the high notes with mathematical precision, and smiled for the cameras. The tragedy of the Philadelphia assembly line was its efficiency. It was so good at producing the sound of hope that it failed to hear the sound of a man dying in its own studio. The hits, "For the Love of Money," "Give the People What They Want," were pouring out of the speakers, but the man delivering the soul was being ground into dust by the very gears that were making him a millionaire. The machine was winning, and William Powell was running out of time. By 1975, the OJs had achieved the impossible. They were the undisputed kings of the Philadelphia sound, their voices soundtracking the aspirations and heartbreaks of a generation. But inside the luxury of the tour bus, the atmosphere had shifted from the euphoria of success to a quiet, terrifying uncertainty. William Powell, the man whose high tenor was the gold standard for every R&B group in America, was starting to fade. The investigative records and tour diaries of this period point to a grim, hidden reality. William was no longer just suffering from the exhaustion the label reported to the press. He was being hunted by a silent predator. It began as a dull, persistent ache in his abdomen, the kind of discomfort that many on the road dismissed as the price of a high-sodium diet, stress, and the relentless vibration of travel. But as the months passed, the ache sharpened into a localized agony. According to accounts from roadies and musicians who traveled with the band, William began to change. He was losing weight at a rate that was impossible to hide under his silk vests. His tailored suits, once filled with the frame of a vibrant young man, began to hang off a body that was becoming skeletal. Then came the moment of forced truth. A late-night car crash, a jagged intersection of exhaustion, and the fast life sent William to the emergency room. It was supposed to be a routine check for internal bleeding from the impact. But as the doctors ran scans, they discovered something far more lethal than any car accident: colon cancer. For a man in his early 30s, at the absolute zenith of global fame, the diagnosis was a death sentence delivered in the sterile white light of a hospital room. In the mid-1970 seconds, colon cancer was often caught too late, and for William, the predator had already taken a firm, irreversible grip. But this is where the story shifts from a medical tragedy to a testament of brutal, almost terrifying resilience. In the high-stakes world of Philadelphia International Records, a canceled tour meant millions in lost revenue and a broken momentum that could end a career. William Powell looked at the contracts. He looked at his brothers, Eddie and Walter, and he made a decision that defies the instinct of self-preservation. He chose to sing through the cancer. The tour logs from late 1975 into 1976 are a record of human endurance pushed past the psychological breaking point. William underwent surgeries and debilitating treatments in secret, but as soon as he could find the strength to stand, he was back in the lineup. Insiders recall the harrowing, nightmarish sight of William in the dressing room, gray-faced, trembling, clutching his stomach in cold sweats, and unable to hold down even a sip of water. Yet, in an act of pure, agonizing will, he would transform the moment the stage lights hit him. He would snap into the intricate choreography, hit those crystalline high notes, and deliver the glow that the public demanded. Why did he stay in the machine? Through an investigative lens, it was likely a mix of loyalty and a desperate need for control. On that stage, he wasn't a dying man in a hospital gown. He was a god in a silk suit. In the music, the cancer couldn't touch him, but the silence between the shows was becoming unbearable. This is also the period where the chemical support became a life-or-death necessity. The heroin that had once been a tool to manage the fatigue of the road was now the only thing that could numb the cancer's bite long enough for him to finish a 40-minute set. He was self-medicating a terminal illness while maintaining the image of a soul superstar. Eddie Levert and Walter Williams watched their brother disintegrate in real time. They begged him to stop, to let the machine grind to a halt so he could find some peace. But William, the stabilizer, the anchor of the harmony, refused to let the light go out. He believed that if he stopped, the world he had built for his brothers would crumble. The final live recordings of William Powell are haunting pieces of history. If you listen closely to his solos in early '76, you can hear it. The soul is no longer just singing about love or unity. He is singing for his very existence. Every note is a violent struggle against the gravity of his own end. The machine was still winning, the records were still selling, but the predator was finishing its work. William Powell was 35 years old, and he was walking toward the final, heavy silence. By late 1976, the Philadelphia assembly line reached a point of no return. The machine was running at peak efficiency, but one of its most vital components was failing. William Powell was no longer just sick, he was fading into a ghost. The man who had spent a decade ensuring every OJ's harmony was mathematically perfect, every note aligned with the precision of a diamond cutter, could now barely find the oxygen to speak, let alone command the stage. The investigative records from the group's inner circle during this period describe a transition that was as clinical as it was heartbreaking. Philadelphia International Records was a business of momentum. The OJs were their flagship, a multi-million-dollar asset that could not afford to sit idle. But the reality was unavoidable. William was no longer a stabilizer. He was a man who required physical stabilization from others just to stand upright in the wings. In a move that Eddie Levert and Walter Williams would later describe as the most gut-wrenching decision of their lives, the search for a replacement began while William was still breathing. They brought in Sammy Strain, a veteran of the Little Anthony and the Imperials. Sammy was a consummate professional. He knew the steps, he knew the discipline, and he understood the Philly sound. But as any soul historian will tell you, a replacement is never an equivalent. Sammy was brought in to keep the love train from derailing, a survivor meant to fill a void that was essentially unfillable. William Powell didn't fight the decision. With the quiet, stoic dignity that had defined his career, he stepped aside. He understood the cold calculus of the industry better than anyone he knew, that in the world of high-stakes R&B, the show doesn't just go on. It demands your absence if you can no longer keep the beat. The final months of William's life were a stark, brutal contrast to the silk-lined luxury of his fame. He retreated from the neon glow of Philadelphia and the high-octane energy of Los Angeles, returning to the familiar, gray, industrial shadows of Canton, Ohio. The man who had once sung for millions in the world's greatest arenas was now confined to a sterile, white-walled hospital room. The investigative lens shows us a man stripped of his glow, stripped of the expensive suits, and finally stripped of the heroin he had used to mask the agony. He was left alone to face the silent predator, with nothing but his fading memories and the muffled sounds of the hospital corridor. According to those few who were allowed to visit him in those final weeks, William remained the anchor of his own soul until the very end. He didn't rail against the unfairness of dying at 35. He didn't curse the label that had used his voice until there was nothing left but bone and shadow. Instead, he spent his remaining strength talking about the music. He would listen to the rough tapes of the group's new recordings, his weak voice offering subtle notes on harmony and phrasing, as if he were still standing in the center, flanked by Eddie and Walter. On the 26th of May, 1977, the music finally stopped. William Powell passed away in a hospital bed in Canton, Ohio. He was 35 years old, a man who had barely reached the prime of his biological life, but had lived an entire century's worth of struggle and triumph within it. The news sent a ripple through the R&B community, but in the corporate offices of the music industry, it was handled with clinical efficiency. There were no national days of mourning. The Philadelphia machine simply adjusted its gears to accommodate the new reality. Sammy Strain became a permanent fixture. The tours continued without a missed beat. The love train kept rolling across the charts. In the ledger of the music business, William Powell's account was closed, and a new one was opened. But for Eddie and Walter, the loss was structural. They had lost the soul within the soul. They had lost the boy they had rehearsed with under the streetlights when they were just kids with a dream. When they buried him in the Ohio soil, they didn't just bury a bandmate. They buried the heartbeat of their youth. William Powell was gone, leaving behind a debt that the industry would never truly acknowledge, let alone repay. He had given his life for a sound that made the world feel whole, even while he was being torn apart. He hit the note. He kept the harmony. And then, he stepped into the eternal silence. When a star falls in the world of soul, the music doesn't stop, it just becomes a catalog. And in the music business, a catalog is a gold mine that never stops giving, provided you don't have to pay the person who built it. For William Powell, the end of his life was only the beginning of a long, dark chapter of financial erasure that we must call by its real name, the unpaid debt. After May 1977, the OJs continued to soar. With Sammy Strain firmly in place, the group released more hits, collected more awards, and solidified their place in the pantheon of legends. But back in Ohio, William's family was discovering the cold reality of the contracts he had signed in his youth. The investigative trail of Philadelphia International Records shows a pattern that was tragically common for black artists of that era. The music was making millions, but the man who provided the soul within the soul had died with almost nothing to show for it. For decades, William's estate, his family, and his children were forced into a grueling legal trench war. They were fighting for royalties that should have been automatic. They were fighting for recognition that should have been undeniable. The industry had used William's voice to build a global empire, yet they argued over every cent owed to his heirs. It is the ultimate irony of the Philadelphia sound. A label built on the message of love, peace, and brotherhood spent years in courtrooms trying to deny a fair share to the family of the man who gave that message its wings. But the debt wasn't just financial, it was historical. For years, the name William Powell began to slip into the fine print. In the documentaries and the retrospective articles, the focus often shifted to the survivors Eddie and Walter. They were the ones still on stage, still giving interviews, still keeping the brand alive. William became a founding member, mentioned in passing, a face in an old black and white photograph. The silent predator had taken his body, and now, the passage of time and the short memory of the industry were attempting to take his legacy. However, you cannot bury a voice like William's. In the late 90s and early 2000s, a new generation of R&B artists began to dig into the crates. Groups like Boys II, Men, and Jodeci didn't just listen to the OJs, they studied them. And what they found was that the stabilizer was the key to the entire formula. They realized that, without William's high-tenor precision, the OJs weren't a soul powerhouse, they were just a vocal group. The unpaid debt started to be settled not in courtrooms, but in the vocal booths of modern recording studios. The investigative records of his legacy finally reached a climax in 2005. The OJs were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. It was a moment of supreme validation, but it was also a moment of reckoning. When Eddie Levert and Walter Williams stood on that stage, they didn't just accept the trophy for themselves, they brought William with them. Eddie Levert, his voice trembling with a grief that 30 years hadn't managed to dull, made sure the world knew, William Powell is the soul of this group. He is why we are here. In that room, filled with the royalty of the music world, the debt was finally acknowledged. The industry could keep the royalties, they could hide the contracts, but they could no longer deny the man. William Powell had been the anchor for the OJs in life, and in death, he became their conscience. The struggle for his family's fair share would continue, but his place in history was finally set in stone. He was no longer a replaceable cog. He was the golden thread that held the entire tapestry of Philly soul together. The debt was immense, and it may never be fully paid in dollars, but in the currency of respect, William Powell was finally a billionaire. Some stories don't end with a standing ovation. They end in the quiet hum of a digital stream, in the crackle of an old vinyl record, and in the hearts of those who still recognize the difference between a singer and a soul. William Powell's story was never just about the rise and fall of a superstar. It was about the endurance of the human spirit in the face of an industry that treats people like fuel. He didn't chase the spotlight. He became the light itself, standing between his brothers and the darkness, holding the harmony together until the very second his heart refused to beat another note. The investigative records of his life end in a hospital in Ohio, but his actual story? That is still being written every single day. You can feel him in the opening chords of Love Train, not just as a voice, but as a vibration of hope that managed to survive the most grueling tour schedules ever devised. You can hear him in the precision of For the Love of Money, a warning about greed that he delivered while he himself was being drained by the very system he was singing about. William Powell didn't just perform these songs, he lived them. He was the soul within the soul, the invisible glue that made the Philadelphia sound more than just music. He made it a lifeline. The OJ's name continued to conquer decades, and Eddie and Walter went on to become elder statesmen of R&B. But to their credit, they never let the world forget the man in the middle. They understood a truth that we must all remember. Greatness isn't always the one screaming for attention. Sometimes, greatness is the quiet stabilizer. It's the person who ensures the foundation is solid, even while their own world is shaking. William Powell lived for 35 years, but he gave us a century of emotion. He hit the notes that we weren't brave enough to hit. He wore the silk suits so we could see the dream, and he carried the pain so we could feel the joy. As we close this file, we realize that the unpaid debt isn't just about royalties. It's about our attention. It's about choosing to remember the man who gave everything to the harmony. Today, William isn't a replaceable cog. He is a masterclass in dignity. He is proof that even if the machine tries to grind you down, your voice, your true, unfiltered soul is untouchable. So, the next time you hear that high tenor glisten through your speakers, don't just think of it as a hit record. Think of it as a victory. Think of it as the sound of a man who won the war against silence. William Powell may have stepped off the stage in 1977, but in the world of soul, he is still standing right where he belongs. In the center, between the fire and the grace, in eternal harmony. Rest easy, William. The love train is still rolling, and your voice is leading the way.